Hello and welcome to why Thurgood Marshall had the most effective strategy at implementing change during the civil rights movement. We will unpack his achievements as well as others, and I've also included a political cartoon that I made at the end. What he did. Marshall saw that America had a checks and balances system in place, and he used this to his advantage by implementing judicial legality, laws, and strategy to persuade the executive branch. During this time, the segregation was sort of divided into four main areas: exclusion as primary voters, housing, separate graduate facilities, and education. These are very important to keep in mind throughout the presentation. There was an overall goal of a comprehensive civil rights bill among all the activists. Although segregation was mainly in the 50s and 60s in terms of when the civil rights movement was heavy, Marshall started his fight in the 40s by implementing his footing into that sort of political system. In 1940, he was anointed chief of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which established his footing in the race. In 44, he won Smith versus Allwright, which was that states could not exclude Black voters from primaries. In 1948, he won Shelley versus Kramer, which struck down race-based restrictive housing covenants. And in 1950, he won Sweat versus Painter, which deemed separate facilities for Black professional and graduate students unconstitutional. At this point, we have already covered 3 of the 4 primary areas for segregation that I mentioned earlier. The 4th is covered in Brown versus the Board of Education, which he won in 1954. This was seen as his most influential case won so far. It was also the most popular as it deemed separate education facilities as unequal. In 61, President Kennedy anointed Marshall to the U.S. Court of Appeals, and in 67, Marshall joined the U.S. Supreme Court as the first African-American member. This really shows his judicial implementation and how he was really integrated into our legal system. He won 91% of his total court cases argued, which was 32. Other main activists included Martin Luther King Jr. as well as Malcolm X. Martin Luther King Jr. was seen as a more peaceful one, as he was the youngest member ever to receive the Nobel Peace Prize for his I Have a Dream speech. This speech was seen as the most influential and impactful speech throughout America's history. He founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which helped him organize his March on Washington, as well as the bus boycott after Rosa Parks. Malcolm X was the second most sought-out speaker in America. He organized temples as a minister, and he had a global unity idealization where he also included Islam. He condemned whites as white devils, and he has no awards to his name despite his contribution to the activist movement. There are many counterarguments stating that Marshall did not have the best strategy for implementing change, and the main one is that his methods took more time, which we see at number 1. This, however, can be debunked by saying that he had a 91% effectiveness with his methods and is the only activist to actually make legal change and not just make publication to the issue. He was not as dedicated to schooling in his past as King was in terms of law school. However, he became a member of the Supreme Court nonetheless and ended up using that degree. He had less of a following. This is very true considering the fact that he was inside of the courthouses and wasn't really on the streets creating that social impact. However, his impact was political, and his audience was the decision makers of the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. In terms of making legality change, there is more quality over quantity for your followers. He was too political and did not register hope on the streets. He was the only political activist making change, and I would argue that there is hope in knowing that somebody from your argument is inside making the change happen with the members of the court. Here's my political cartoon that I created for this. Up at the top, we can see Marshall shaking the hands of the government, and we have 2 segments for King and Malcolm X down at the bottom. The purpose of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X's segments both being the same is that they were both arguing in the same way, whereas they were outside of the Capitol's bars. Whereas inside, Marshall was shaking the hands of the government, and we see paint on their hands as well as on the Constitution in the back, which sort of symbolizes that there was change happening in there. Lastly, I included a quote from Thurgood Marshall himself, and the main points are that many of us knew the final solution would have to be politics. If for no other reason, politics is cheaper than lawsuits. So now we have both. We have our legal arm and we have our political arm. Let's use them both and don't listen to this myth that it can be solved by either or that it has already been solved. Take it from me, it has not been solved. Marshall states here that none of the three activists actually solved segregation, including himself. However, he argues that he had the most effective strategy because he was in the politics. He was making the change happen, and there was legal facts of the change happening at the time, whereas Malcolm and Martin Luther King were creating sort of just that publicity standpoint for it. Overall, I hope that you enjoyed my presentation. Thank you for watching, and I hope that you learned something.